it's the late 80s. Perestroika has started, the opening, the restructuring of the Soviet Union. Gorbachev sends one of his aides, his top aides, to London. And he says, they're onto something over there. I'm not sure what it is, but send him over. So a couple days go by, and this aide is taken around to the stock exchange, to the London School of Economics, to all of the premier places of British power and British organization. And the aide blurts out, a couple days in, and says, stop. I need to know why there are no queues for bread. Why are there no bread lines? Take me to whoever is in charge of the bread supply in London. And the Brits look around and kind of just are very confused at what's going on. And they say, there's no head baker of London. There's no system for the bread here. And the Soviet aide is just in absolute awe that in fact it was the bakers, right? The supply and demand. It was getting information from all sorts of people, getting information every day as their customers would come, a little more to bake, a little less to bake. It was the bakers who had all the power. And that's how the system worked, right? And it is that same philosophy that gives all of us, whether you're in fraud, whether you're in security, whether you're in intelligence, that's what gives us the same capability. We are those bakers. So I am excited to be here with you. I hope that you go back and see your role on the front lines of security as important, but also as the key to how we will understand the next generation of threats. Thank you. Defense is hard, whether you're in fraud, whether you're in intelligence, whether you're in network security. A craft or an art where you don't sleep well every night, where your vigilance is valued. If you and I were sitting here 10 years ago together, and I told you that nation states, Russia, China, the US, North Korea, Iran, were going to be the main contours of this space, of cyberspace, for the next decade, and we would be sitting here talking about how acts in cyberspace translated to warfare, whether it was in economics or in information, you would have thought we were talking about science fiction, and I probably would have. Whether they're criminals, whether they're militaries, whether they're spies, the people behind this and the motivations that they've had have far outstripped our industries, our security mindset, our ability, even by the most paranoid of analysts, to think through how this domain would be used. Sure, we're all out here to secure assets, right? But what are those assets? Yes, credit card numbers, bank accounts, sure, that's obvious. But this got so much bigger so quickly. We went from just thinking about this in terms of financial and quantifiable assets to thinking about targets that included people's minds, that included companies' reputations, intellectual property. So far-ranging, the actors are so complicated, and the targets that we're out to protect are everything from existential to what's in your wallet or on your smartphone. What are we to do 10 years as prologue? Let's go back through how these main characters, nation states, have changed how we think about this domain and how we can draw some of the lessons that we missed or forgot or glazed over in the busy decade we've had in this space, and secrets that are too good to keep. And in this case, we couldn't quite figure out which flavor of secret it was. Companies were getting hacked, especially defense industrial base companies, Boeings, etc. And then we would get these reports coming out of IT guys about remote access Trojans. Shady Rats was one of the favorite ones. A copy of the F-35 fighter jet show up in a Chinese military parade. And then Boeing had a problem, but we couldn't put it together. It's too good to keep that something was going on. But it didn't matter because we couldn't figure out how to talk about the data. Everything from the malware being used to how an attacker got onto an enterprise network, the vector they had used to get in, how they moved laterally, the infrastructure behind the attack. All of these different forensic details led us back to a military unit in Shanghai, 61398 of the Chinese People's Liberation Army. And it was through that detailed dig of all this data as analysts that we put together, in this report that we released showing that data, that we were able to help people understand that there was a military behind the intellectual property theft and the hacking that had happened to get at that IP. But how did we do it? How did just a dump of data change people's minds? Features that a careless developer had left in his malware. Open source job descriptions for people to work in that unit. How all these different data pieces told us a story that we were able to portray with the facts that we had. And the story was this: there were hackers, there were people, and thousands of them, working in a building, and we had a picture of the building even, working in a building outside of Shanghai. And it was then that people in Washington, people in corporations across the world, could then see what was going on, right? And this report was called APT1, Advanced Persistent Threat 1, this space. This was no longer some problem that happened in IT that could be written off by a chief information officer as some problem that IT needs to work on. Maybe we should fund another tool for them. This was so much bigger. This now was an existential question and a liability at the board level. Sure, defense industrial-based companies sort of know that they're playing in a semi-government space, but they weren't the only ones affected by APT1, this Chinese group out of the Chinese steel, pharmaceuticals, companies that mirrored the Chinese 5-year economic plan were right in the sweet spot of of the companies that were coming to us and saying, we have a problem, tell us what's on our network. And what we saw as we investigated was that that targeting wasn't just what you would traditionally think a military wanted. Secrets about planes, blueprints, GPS coordinates for an operation. No, this was way bigger. We're the crown jewels of corporations who had spent 15, 25 years in some cases developing everything from vaccines to clean energy technology to electric vehicles. Going on with what nation states are doing. We think Russia has a capability. We're not quite sure how to explain what the government wants to do or where the capability is. And by the way, we have no idea what they're doing. So start digging, figure it out. This is way bigger. This new information sphere, as they term it, encapsulates the thoughts, the narratives, the reputation, the way people think. And that space, this broader information sphere with this technical and psychological component, is going to be the defining domain of the next century. And this is 2000. This is way before Steve Jobs is thinking about iPhones. This is before Mark Zuckerberg's thinking about Facebook. This is a long time ago, right? People barely have internet in Russia at this point. But what the Russian government got early was that there was going to be this domain that would have an ability to influence that didn't look like the traditional mechanisms of state power, like a military, like an economy, right? And they invested, and they thought about it a lot. On the other side, there was an enormous trend going on in a lot of militaries, including in the US. And it was this concept of net-centric warfare. And in Russia, it was mimicked closely to see how the US had fought well in battles in the 90s, in Desert Storm, etc. And here's what the concept is. It's called power to the edge. The idea is, instead of the structure that you and I all think of as chain of command or a box and line chart in your organization where someone's on top, they give directions to the next level goes down and implements, and off you go, and decision-making power sort of flows from the top on down. Instead of a model like that, which was the traditional way that all militaries had been set up, the US had been implementing this network, a flat, decentralized approach to command and control, to how you give decision-making authority out. And in this web, if you want to think of it that way, decision-making power is pushed to the edge to the people who are fighting a battle, people who are implementing something, the doers, right? Instead of the people down at the bottom in that hierarchy chart who don't have a lot of power to do anything besides what they've been told. This net-centric flat model uses the combined situational awareness of the different members in that network to go and implement things. All right, well, let me show you why I think this is interesting, right? This change in structure is picked up widely by the Russian military as they think about developing capability in cyberspace, in this information sphere. They think of it this way. If you're able to have plausibly deniable actors who are somehow linked but get their directions loosely and go and implement creatively, then you are able to capture the advantage of this domain. You're able to act in a way without impunity. It's not clear where a command came from. It's not clear if you're part of a military organization. You might just be a random actor who gets this information. And we saw this tested for years. It took a while to perfect. In 2007, from the first mark of a nation-state cyber attack in Estonia, the Estonians were taking down an old Soviet soldier statue. And what happened next was this ground-flattening cyber attack that takes Estonia, then highly networked, still now, highly networked, down to their knees. No banking sector, no government services, for weeks. And it was this first attempt at this decentralized model being used in cyberspace. Patriotic hackers is what we called the guys who are behind this. But within days, it was so obvious and so clear that they were directed in some format by the Kremlin that that decentralized approach with plausible deniability built into it wasn't really working. Well, the same thing happened in 2009 in Georgia. Smart observers said, look, Russia's deploying their same kind of cyber capability here, pretending that they're just patriotic guys off doing some good things for Mother Russia, but clearly they're getting state direction. All right, fast forward to 2010. The Russian military goes out and codifies this concept. They're now getting more confident that there's something there, even if they don't quite know how to do it. And in the military doctrine, they write that information warfare, information confrontation, will be used to couple the kinetic actions, the wartime actions of Russia, of the Russian military. So basically, we're going to implement cyber warfare within our broader suite of weapon systems. We're going to use this to favorably predispose world opinion to the Russian use of force. We're going to use this information warfare so that people see why Russia is doing something and agree with it. Fine. It's always easy to write off at the time. But then you go to 2014, and my team got a very interesting glimpse of what Russia was doing. We found a group that we named APT, Advanced Persistent Threat 28. They were taking documents from military attachés. They were taking emails from defense ministers. They were going and taking Chechen journalists' emails. When we put together the data, similar to how we had worked in APT-1 with the Chinese, we saw a military going after military secrets. Okay. But we had spotted the Russians and we had done it outside of any classified sources. This was all in the public domain. And in 2014, we got some press about this. We talked about it. The Russian military is hacking military secrets. But so goes it. Every state who wants to be involved in espionage does some level of espionage. Here it is on a computer. Okay, fine. But what that ended up being the precursor to was 2016. We had the perfect storm of all of these different elements. The information security doctrine that defined the domain in 2000. This power to the edge decentralized concept in how militaries and other groups would work. And then a military conflict and the use of information warfare to favorably predispose opinion towards the Russian government. And we had this data point of the forensics behind this group that would be the Russian military. So what did we see in 2016? So 3 different things happened that have been wildly confused and brought together in a lot of different ways. The first thing we started to see was this wide use of hacking and leaking. And it was these same guys, APT-28, the Russian military. They would go in to the DNC, to the World Anti-Doping Agency. This is widely forgotten now, but during the Olympics, as the Russian athletes had been banned from the Olympics, their organization, the World Anti-Doping Agency, gets hacked. So they're getting hacked, the DNC is getting hacked, other organizations are getting hacked, and then those emails are coming out later on WikiLeaks, or this website called DC Leaks that gets stood up by APT 28. Okay, what else is happening? Groups like the IRA, or what's been called the St. Petersburg Troll Farm, the Internet Research Agency, are out there amplifying information, sometimes organic, sometimes it's coming from news sources. In other cases, it's information that's completely falsified, disinformation or misinformation, and they're amplifying it through social media. Bots on Twitter, Facebook profiles that are constructed, right? And they're doing a third thing. They're actually setting up real-life events where people could go to protest. Probably remember this, right? People showed up in Florida. There was a Texas secessionist movement. These were all fomented and completely fake events, orchestrated thousands of miles away in Russia, being perpetrated through social media. So why did it take so long for us to wake up to this, for us to collectively be able to understand what Russia was doing and really see it for what it was, which was this multi-pronged security threat that wasn't just after emails, right? It was after democracy. It was after how you deepened the fissures, in this case in the US, and pushed people apart and made them question their beliefs and what was true and what wasn't. How did this all happen? On the US side, we hadn't been thinking of cyberspace in these broader psychological terms like the Russians had. We were on a totally different playing field. In the Department of Defense and more broadly in the US government, people thought of cyberspace as the ones and zeros, infrastructure of the internet, your network that you defend, right? But we weren't thinking about how this could be used on multi-platform, in the media scene, in people's minds, and how this influence would go far, far wider than if you had just hacked a network, right? So it was like two ships passing in the night. The Russians were playing on a much larger psychological field, while the US was catching up to understand what was happening. Motivation was huge. If we had understood this, if we had been able to talk about it more broadly, we would have been able to define this space, this security threat, much earlier. And the targets would have been clearer too. I'll end Russia on this note. In 2010, one of the most interesting writings I had seen from the Arab Spring, of the many overthrows of governments in the Middle East, was that the Russians saw social media's role in that as not just an extension of the US government's activity, but they saw what was happening in the Arab Spring as a use of this domain that was incredibly successful. If social media could be the platform to overthrow governments, it could be the platform to change people's minds, it could be used in this much darker fashion that we would later see and are still dealing with since 2016. And into 2011, the US government sort of cheekily denied, but very clearly said that they were behind an attack called Stuxnet. Now let me just see, who remembers Stuxnet? A smattering, good. So Stuxnet, I think, is the precedent for how so many different governments were motivated to act in cyberspace since then. Let me tell you why. Stuxnet was a piece of malware directed into the PCL, into the logic controller, for the centrifuge creator in a plant in Iran. Now, if you go back to 2011, the US is incredibly worried about Iran developing a nuclear program. And this malware changes how fast the speeds of the centrifuges go, wipes out a fifth of the centrifuges in the Iranians' capability, and has a massive effect on their ability to build out their program. What Stuxnet did was two things. The first was it made the US clearly a power to be reckoned with in cyberspace. And everyone said, wow, if you can take the Iranian nuclear program down to its knees, the US clearly has a capability here, right? But the second thing that it did is really a kind of can of worms that we're still dealing with today. We started seeing that if the US could act in this space short of war without impunity, if we could do operations from the US side out to other countries without declaring war, for instance, right? Without the standard trappings of what sovereignty and breaching someone else's sovereignty is required, then other states would feel that they could too. And interestingly enough, Russia's seen sovereignty in this space, in cyberspace, as one of the core ways in how they've defined it. They think of that whole psychological and technical space as sovereign. But when you have something like Stuxnet happening, where the US government, along with the Israelis, have gone out and impinged on the Iranian nuclear program in its networks, right? In its nuclear program, then it opened the doors for other states to think about how do we act, how do we take advantage of this as well. I mean, with malware that was used against the development and deployment of nuclear missiles. So we have seen the US motivated in this space in a similar fashion to how the US has acted generally in its defense goals, right? We're not seeing a particularly creative use, quite frankly, of this domain, whereas we saw the Russians using this fairly creatively, and we saw the Chinese going after it in an untraditional sense, in an economic way, right? So the US has paralleled its defense aims through what it's done in cyberspace. And maybe it's because the US has been a more predictable actor, and a lot of us know the example and think of cyberspace in that way, which has made it harder for people to see the motivations and targets that other countries, that other actors have employed. Korea, to me, epitomizes how a misunderstanding of intent can truly lead to disastrous consequences. You would ask whether North Korea is one of the top 5 states in cyberspace, the answer would probably be no, right? Do they even have electricity? Was truly, and I don't say that in a laughable way, that was the understanding of where North Korea was. A company called Sony started to get warnings that the movie that they were producing was igniting fear and really bothering the North Korean government. Who saw the interview? For 2014, Sony is now down to their knees. Email has been hacked. You can't even get in line in the cafeteria and use your credit card. They've gone to the basement and taken the old credit card machines with a little tracer on top of your credit card, right? Computers. No one's getting paid. Everyone's at home, and their files have been completely destroyed. So much for taking North Korea seriously, right? It is the epitome of misunderstanding intent. Well, then how do we align something like the WannaCry attack or the Bank of Bangladesh breach with what North Korea had done to Sony over a movie, right? Well, I see it this way. Attribution hasn't been solved. It's still difficult to figure out who's behind attacks in cyberspace. It took years, it took a year and a half before the NotPetya attack that felled multinationals in Ukraine in 2017. It took a year and a half before the British government and the US government attributed it to the same Russian military hackers, the GRU. But it can be done. Attribution is now not the question that was the debilitating factor of how we, as security professionals, were worried about being able to do our job. If we couldn't say who was behind it, we lacked the ability to explain more about the attack. Attribution is now not that factor. How about asymmetry? Just to go to every cybersecurity conference for years, and you would talk about the asymmetric nature of this space. The idea that you could have 5 guys in a basement out there hacking and taking down the power grid, right? Now, there's certainly an aspect of that that continues. But we've now seen the number of actors who are capable of evading a much stronger defensive position that most companies, that most ICS systems are in, most governments now have. We've seen that group of actors shrink to a point that it is harder to imagine that 4 guys in a basement somewhere will be able to take down an enormous target, and that's a good thing. So asymmetry and attribution, these concepts that defined the difficulty of our space, have been mitigated a bit. But now our question is around this motivation and the space that we want to think about motivation in, and the targets, the assets that we're protecting. So what will happen next? How will motivation change? I think just as I used that example for how militaries have changed, how that decentralized flat network is now what militaries, what actors, what hackers are now using. We have to think that motivation as a concept will follow that same paradigm. What do I mean? When I talked about the Chinese, when I talked about the Russians, when I talked about the US, and even North Korea, we were able to plot the lines from what the country's government wanted and what they did in cyberspace. And that's not how we did the attribution, but that's how we understood the motivation for why they took the actions that they did. I think that's going to get far more difficult. We're going to see when motivation is much harder to trace back to a state actor, and when we're going to have to rely on understanding what happened on the target side to even understand what was being taken and who could potentially benefit from that 4 or 5 hands down the road. Benign neglect, plausible deniability, these concepts that we threw around as ways for nation states to harness the anonymity in this space are going to be pushed even further when it comes to motivation, to be able to cover the tracks, to be able to change how people and how analysts and how governments think about who's behind attacks and who's behind malicious activity. Social media and trying to take down a democracy, to how the Chinese went after intellectual property theft, and North Korea has been after not just money, but also how people think about art, how companies act. If that all feels huge, it should. But here is the hope to me in this space. And here's the light that I see as someone who's been in the front lines of it. It took the individuals who said, there's something wrong here, there might be more. I need to go and put together these data points. It wasn't people saying, how do I go and find some huge programmatic answer to this? It was the analysts, it was the security professionals, it was the people on the edge who were able to redefine this threat, who were able to start solving the problem, who were able to wave the flags that something was wrong in an effective way. I think that's how we're going to solve this. It's how we're going to understand the next level of change that our adversaries are going to be putting against us. And our ability to defend against it is epitomized in a story from old Soviet days. It's the late 80s. Perestroika has started opening, the restructuring of the Soviet Union. Gorbachev sends one of his aides, his top aides, to London. And he says, they're onto something over there. I'm not sure what it is, but send him over. So a couple days go by, and this aide is taken around to the stock exchange, the London School of Economics, to all of the premier places of British power and British organization. And the aide blurts out, a couple days in, and says, stop. I need to know why there are no queues for bread. Why are there no bread lines? Take me to whoever is in charge of the bread supply in London. And the Brits look around and kind of just are very confused at what's going on. And they say, there's no head baker of London. There's no system for the bread here. And the Soviet aide is just in absolute awe that in fact it was the bakers, right? The supply and demand. It was getting information from all sorts of people, getting information every day as their customers would come, a little more to bake, a little less to bake. It was the bakers who had all the power. And that's how the system worked, right? And it is that same philosophy that gives all of us, whether you're in fraud, whether you're in security, whether you're in intelligence, that's what gives us the same capability. We are those bakers. So I am excited to be here with you. I hope that you go back and see your role on the front lines of security as important, but also as the key to how we will understand the next generation of threats. Thank you.